Hey everyone, it's Friday. It's Engaging Walk. My name is Drake, and today we're going to be talking about politics and dating. I'm going to be flying solo today, but stay tuned also on Monday. Make sure you look out for that episode coming up. We're going to be talking about, is jealousy healthy in a relationship? We've also got some other surprise topics that are going to be peppered in there. So make sure you guys stay tuned in for that. Again, that's coming up this upcoming Monday. All right, so it's the 23rd. It's February. We're getting close to the end of the month. Lots of things are happening in the world. We've also got taxes if you're United States coming up. Make sure you get your taxes done. I know that's something that me and the missus are going to have to do. So yeah, a lot of crazy things happening in the world. So thought we would talk a little bit about politics and dating and or marriage. And I think that there's a lot of people these days that politics is a make or break in terms of their relationship. You know, you want to make sure that your people these days are really, a lot of these people these days are ending friendships based off of politics. Like, hey, I don't want to even associate with people that are on the opposite end of the political spectrum, whether it be like I'm a Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal. You know, people are like, you know, I don't even want to associate with those other people, period, let alone in the dating world. So, you know, in this increased polarization, it makes sense to at least talk about politics and how that relates to dating. The nation is becoming increasingly political. It wasn't always like that. I think when I was growing up here in the United States, I grew up in the Northeast in Boston, and you didn't really know back then if your teachers were Democrat or Republican, how they thought about politics, what they thought about the president, what they thought about the political leaders. They didn't really mention any of those things. And the news, for the most part, was, I would say, if not unbiased, it was just sort of like neutral. You know, I think they did a pretty good job back then. We're talking, you know, early to mid 1990s about being, you know, run of the mill, you know, your who, what, when, where, why of journalism. But things have certainly changed in the last, I want to say, since about 2005 onward. So for the last about 20 years or so, the United States has become increasingly polarized in dramatic fashion. So it would make sense to at least discuss political leanings in dating. And I think that makes sense. And because for a variety of reasons, which we're going to be talking about in this episode. So is politics in and of itself important? I would say no, it's not, in terms of compatibility. But the implications in a increasingly polarized society of how those political leanings manifest themselves can be actually quite dramatic and should be taken seriously when you're involved with the other person, because of the implications it can have in terms of like child development, child raising, whether or not you even want to have a family, all those things. So you definitely want to at least know, like, how is this person feeling about, not necessarily about like the president. I think the president is just, you know, as a person that gets elected every 4 years. It's not really a measure of value, of personal values, which is what you really want to go after. You really want to understand, like, how does this person feel about family development, family, or how they feel about like raising children. Do they even want to have children? I think a lot of left-leaning people these days don't even want to have children. I think a lot of them are very much in the stance of environmentalism, and having children is bad for the environment. So you can see how these can complicate a relationship if you have different political leanings. Let's say one person is, by today's standards, conservative, and the other person is liberal. And the conservative person is like, hey, I want to have a family. I want to have about like 2 or 3 kids, maybe even more. I want to live out in the countryside. And the left-leaning person is like, I don't want to have any children. I think children are bad for the environment. I think that I'd prefer to live in the city. I would much prefer to, you know, have a left-leaning type of relationship. So you can see how the politics of the situation isn't really important. It's not really like they're discussing politics. It's more that we're discussing in this case values, which in today's day does overlap with political leanings. Now, I have seen a lot of cases where, and this tends to happen pretty often in the case in which the woman is more left leaning and the man is more conservative leaning. And once they develop into a relationship, that the woman becomes much more conservative in a relationship with a conservative man. I have seen that happen a lot more often in that direction than in the opposite. But again, that's from more of like my personal experience of, talking with people that are in relationships like that, once the man, who's more conservative leaning, discussed like the inner workings of political action, or how they feel, political philosophy rather, that the woman's perspective tended to change over actually a short period of time. So I think that this, you don't. That's why I'm saying it's not necessarily a deal breaker, because I think a lot of people in these days will get into like camps. They're like, well, I don't like this person, I don't like this president, I don't like this politician, so therefore I belong in this category. And in today's day and age, there's not really like a whole lot of fluidity in terms of like, well, if I'm left leaning, then I have to like mark all these boxes, and if I'm right leaning, I have to mark all these boxes. Whereas, I think in the past, people kind of picked and chose like their positions on things, and it didn't necessarily make or break whether they were on the one side or the other. But that has totally changed, like I said, in the last like 20 years. That being said, people that feel one way about an issue tend to just like, oh, well, since this camp tends to think this way, then I therefore belong in this camp. But I think once you meet somebody who, from at least from my experience, from what I've seen, is that people, once they meet and they're like, okay, well, this person, I really like this person. This person is really nice. This person is like a good, genuine person, but we differ politically. Well, once they start having those conversations, once they start seeing like, oh, well, actually, we don't really differ that much, and this is a good, healthy relationship, and their ideas start to meld, and then their identity starts to like really form as a couple, and that can be really powerful because you're taking in that other person's perspective and you're growing, which can really happen in a lot of situations. But it can also, you have to be really careful with this, because it can also lead to a lot of division if you're not clear and you're not honest about exactly how you feel about those things and why. For example, one of the cases that can really make or break a relationship is the view of children. If you're like, yeah, you know what? In your heart, you're like, I really do want children. But you're like, I really love this person. They're really great, but they don't want to have children. And I've seen this a lot. In a lot of cases due to their political leanings. Again, with this environmentalism, a lot of people that feel that way about environmentalism really feel like children are bad for the environment, so they don't want it. They don't want to increase the population. They don't want to put that extra strain. I think that's in my personal opinion, I think that that's not a good way to think, a good outlook on life, but nevertheless, some people do have that position. And then people that are more conservative are like, hey, you know what? I do really tend to be like more, I do want to have a family. I do want to raise our own children. And then let's say, for example, they're in that strife where they're like, I really like this person, but they don't really feel this way about children. But I think that maybe as time goes on, they can soften on their position. I think that can be a mistake. I think you need to have those conversations, and you need to be, having those flushed out in the beginning. or at least once there's a moment of understanding that this relationship can go somewhere, and you want to have those conversations much more thoroughly to feel at that process of like compatibility in the long term. Again, so this is going to also cover areas not just in terms of family and whether or not you even want to have one, but how you would raise the children, where you would raise the children. Are you open to moving? A lot of people, once they have families, tend to move to the suburbs or in rural areas. So, is that something that your partner is even open for in terms of like moving once you have a family? Also, there's also a lot of going on in terms of transgenderism these days, and you know that can really have a major impact on a family if there's differences in terms of political leanings. Now, personally, I think that this is gonna not be such a prominent issue 5 to 10 years from now. I think that it won't be pushed the way that it has been in the last like 10 years or so. But nevertheless, some people do feel very strongly about that issue on both sides, and that can be a deal breaker. That can be something that will cause significant pain and suffering in a relationship if you hear these horror stories that happen in Canada and in the United States where the father or the mother is very strongly against it, and then the other parent is strongly in favor of it, and then they have a child that is going through this issue, and that can be really traumatic for everybody. So I think there's not a whole lot of like changing that happens. So I feel like if you're in terms of like positions on those things, so if you definitely want to have those conversations also with your potential spouse if you're in that dating period of like, hey, what would happen if we have children and they say that they want to have this gender reassignment surgery, and they're like, hey, you know what, I'm all for that, and you're like, no, I'm not for that. I think that would be terrible. I think you can suss out the conversation a little bit more, but that would be a major, major red flag. So again, the idea is not really, in my opinion, is this person a Republican or a Democrat, but more an assessment of their values and seeing, do these values align with mine in terms of family, in terms of family development, how we would raise children, where we would live. Everything else, I think, is not really a conversation in terms of like a marriage or dating, because the marriage and the dating and marriage isn't really based off of political beliefs. I think that even in my own relationship with my wife, like we don't really discuss those things. We more discuss values, family development, how we run the household, faith, finances, fitness. All those things are much more in our daily conversation than politics. We could probably go months without discussing it. Maybe if something happens, or if we're listening to like a podcast and it pops up, then we would have a discussion about it. But that's not the focal point of the relationship. And I think that's true for most successful relationships. But again, suss out those issues that are tied into political issues these days, and really get a good feeling for them of how this person feels about child rearing, family development, location in which they would like to move or that they're open to moving. And those can be a great determining factor of whether or not this person is going to be really suitable for you. So again, I think these days it's so weird that in this time in America that like all these things are actually like kind of like woven into one. And another topic, a major topic of this that I hadn't really discussed yet, is gender roles in the relationship. How does this person feel about, how the man is supposed to be treated in the relationship and the woman? A lot of those things are also tied into political leanings today, especially in terms of like feminism and all those kinds of things that people know about these days. But you want to talk those things through. Make sure you understand how the person feels about, like, what sort of role in a relationship that in a long-term serious relationship would look like, especially if the woman or the man. There's a lot of that these days that are like really into like modern feminism. So if you have one expectation going into the marriage or going into the relationship, and it turns out to be another thing, then that can be a really significant cause for strife and conflict in the relationship that you definitely want to understand going in. So that can look like this, for example, like you're having this conversation, you're like, hey, how do you feel about feminism these days? You talk to the woman and she's like, I'm really into feminism. I feel like women should be really empowered. And yeah, that's what I really like about feminism. Well, that's not the same as a lot of interpretations of modern feminism. So, for example, the woman, you have this exact conversation with a different woman, and you're like, how do you feel about feminism? And she's like, I think that men and women are equal in all respects. That if I want to work and you want to work, then like that would work for us in a relationship. And I'm not really open to how a man is gonna give me direction in our lives, in our married life. Well, that could set off a lot of red flags for a lot of men, or at least a certain amount of men. And you'd want to like really have that discussion of like, well, what do you mean like taking direction from? What exactly does that look like to you? Because in a marriage, there's a lot of taking direction from both sides, and it depends on like what the issue is, and it depends on the circumstances. And a lot of women these days are just like not open to hearing from that. They think of it as like mansplaining, whereas that is a really, in my opinion, a really dismissive point of view, because that says like that there's not a whole lot of going back and forth in the relationship and ironing out like what is driving at it, because you're both going to have different perspectives on a lot of different things, and not being able to compromise and not being able to see each other's value in that perspective can really hinder the relationship and can really hinder how far the relationship can go, because we all have our own blind spots and we all have our own narrow point of views and our own ways in which we can act selfishly, that we can act in self-interest. But if the goal is the relationship and the goal is achieving a higher purpose in the relationship, i.e. the marriage, then if one side is like, hey, I have nothing to value from you, that you can't explain anything to me, that essentially that's a position of like, I'm over you, I'm above you, and pretty much anything that you say is not going to be of value in the relationship. Well, that can be a big red flag there. So you definitely want to have those conversations and be like, well, what do you mean by you're not going to be willing to take direction? There's going to be times in which you're going to be wrong. We're all human. This is not just like a man versus woman thing. This is a relationship thing, that in any situation, in any type of relationship, whether it be a band, coworkers, music artists, projects, relationships, any type of relationship, there's going to be different points of view, and they're all going to see different things differently. But they all have to be tuned in a certain way to a higher purpose again. And if the man is like, I'm right all the time and like whatever you say is wrong, then that's going to be a certain domination from one point of view that is very limited. And if the woman likewise has her own point of view that's like very similar, then that's not going to be beneficial to the relationship. So you should be able to work together and fine-tuning your perspectives in alignment for the benefit of the relationship, which will then translate to the marriage. So this would be a long way of describing like how that conversation would go about, but it nevertheless is a very important conversation to have, because a lot of that is going to happen in marriage, where buying a car together, buying a home together, you're both going to want different things from the joint purchases and the joint journey that you're taking. And what you'll find is you both come together and make a better decision that neither of you would have made on your own, because it's for a higher purpose. It is for the relationship, for what the relationship is trying to achieve, e.g. children or a business or sustainability for yourselves and for your community and for your family, your extended family, for example. So all those things come together, and in my opinion, a certain perspective of feminism really prevents that from happening. So, everyone's different. Everyone has different types of relationships that they want to get into, which also these days will tie into a lot of like political leanings. For example, people on the left tend to really be into these days with like open marriages, which I think that doesn't work. That doesn't work at all. That's not even like a marriage, in my opinion. But we can discuss that in another podcast. And people more conservative leaning are like, hey, you know what? Man and woman together, this is how it was intended to be, and this is how it works. So this is the only area that, in terms of like sexual relationships is going to be, which is, again, no cheating, no outside relationships with other people. Swinging and all those things are not part of the relationship, because they degrade and destroy the relationship that's based off trust, that's based off of mutual understanding, that's based off of an understanding that we are together forever. So those are all conversations that you want to have that encompass around the area of political leanings, but aren't political in and of themselves. They're just political in this day and age because of the encampments that have been brought up. So I think I'm going to end with that. It's Friday. Make sure you guys have a great evening today, and again, look for our new podcast that's going to be coming out, our episode rather, that's going to be coming out on Monday, in which we're going to discuss is jealousy healthy in a relationship? So which I think will be a really interesting topic. We have a lot of things to discuss about that, and some ancillary topics that are related to it. So yeah, definitely take a look out for that. That's going to be coming up on Monday. I want to thank you guys for tuning into Engaging Walk. Again, my name is Drake. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google. I think Google just got rid of podcasts in general. But you can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify, on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, like in Pandora. Make sure you guys share this podcast with people that you think might benefit from it. People that are single, people that are married, dating, etc. We cover a wide variety of topics here on Engaging Walk regarding those things. So if you want more information, you can always go to www.engagingwalk.com. And we'll see you next week. Thanks. Have a great weekend, you guys.